the formal challenge arrived exactly as galactic protocol demanded. Broadcast in ceremonial Skarran across every diplomatic frequency in known space, addressed to the primitive Terran species and its so-called fleet, and delivered with a theatrical grandeur that had for 6,000 years preceded every conquest the Skarrat Imperium had ever undertaken. By the authority of Emperor Vashtor Kell, ruler of the Nine Reaches and sovereign of the Skarrat Imperium, the transmission declared, the Terran species is hereby challenged to formal combat trial for possession of the perimeter colonies. Should Terran forces fail to answer this challenge with an assembled fleet within 30 solar rotations, all contested territory shall pass to Imperial control by default, and the Terran species shall be declared unworthy of continued sovereign status. Admiral Diane Kessler watched the translated transmission finish, playing on the briefing room screen aboard Earth's orbital command station, then looked around at the assembled faces of her senior staff, several of whom appeared to be suppressing outright laughter. A formal combat trial, she repeated. They want to fight us in a ritualized, pre-announced battle, on a schedule they picked, at a location they picked, because that's apparently how the Skarrat Imperium has settled territorial disputes for 6,000 years. It's practically a courtesy invitation to our own conquest, said Captain Malik Osei, her chief tactical officer, not bothering to hide his amusement. They're telling us exactly when and where they're going to attack. I almost feel bad for them. Kessler allowed herself a small, tired smile. 6 years earlier, when the Skarrat Imperium had first made contact with humanity, following an accidental border incursion near the perimeter colonies, the initial diplomatic exchanges had been coldly informative. If condescending, the Imperium clearly regarded humanity as a young, unrefined species barely worth the trouble of formal conquest. What none of the Imperium's diplomats, strategists, or intelligence analysts had apparently bothered to properly investigate in the 6 years since, was exactly how much humanity had changed in that time, and exactly how seriously Earth had taken the prospect of exactly this moment ever since. Convene the Combined Fleet Command, Kessler said. It's time to accept an invitation. The Skarrat Imperium had good reason for its confidence. In 6,000 years of recorded history, the Imperium had conducted formal combat trials against 43 separate species disputing territorial claims, and had won every single one, typically overwhelming its opponents through sheer scale. Massive capital ships bristling with heavy plasma cannon, deployed in numbers that few young civilizations could hope to match, backed by 6 millennia of refined naval doctrine passed down through an unbroken line of imperial war colleges. Fleet Marshal Dresh Kalorn, appointed by Emperor Vashtor Kell himself, to command the assembled imperial task force, had reviewed Terran military capability with the same brisk efficiency he'd applied to 42 previous campaigns. Human vessels, by every metric his analysts could gather from 6 years of limited borders, skirmishes, and intercepted communications, remained conventionally armed, modestly shielded, and organized around a military doctrine that appeared to borrow heavily, and somewhat crudely, from early imperial naval theory the Skarrat themselves had abandoned centuries earlier. They call it the Combined Fleet, Kalorn told his own senior staff, reviewing the latest intelligence brief with something approaching bemusement. 40-some vessels, by our best count, against our own deployment of 160. They have accepted our challenge, apparently, out of some combination of pride and ignorance about what a formal combat trial actually entails. Should we anticipate any unconventional tactics, Marshal? Asked his intelligence officer, Vesa Thrain. Their border engagements have shown occasional creativity. Kalorn waved the concern aside. Every young species shows occasional creativity in its opening skirmishes. Thrain. It rarely survives contact with genuine imperial discipline. No, I anticipate a conventional engagement, over quickly, and a new set of colonies added to imperial control within the week. Prepare the fleet for ceremonial departure. Let us not keep the Terrans waiting for their education. What Kalorn's confident assessment failed to account for largely, because imperial intelligence gathering had never needed to account for it in 6,000 years of uninterrupted dominance. was that humanity had spent every one of the 6 years since first contact treating the Skarrat Imperium not as a distant curiosity but as an inevitability to be prepared for with total focused urgency. Admiral Kessler's combined fleet command had used those 6 years well. Earth's scientific and industrial base, still humanity's own and entirely independent of any imperial technology transfer, had been redirected almost entirely toward a singular goal: closing the gap between human and Skarrat military capability before the inevitable formal challenge arrived. "We can't outbuild them," Kessler had told the assembled leaders of Earth's Unified Defense Council in the earliest planning sessions following first contact. 6,000 years of industrial base means they'll always have more ships than we can field, for the foreseeable future. So we're not going to try to outbuild them, we're going to outthink them, and we're going to do it using every advantage a young, adaptable species has over an empire that spent 6 millennia, assuming its own methods are beyond improvement. That philosophy had produced, over 6 years of intense, focused development, a fleet built around a doctrine the Skarrat Imperium's ancient naval academies had never needed to develop. Distributed, adaptive combat intelligence, allowing human vessels to coordinate and adjust tactics in real time, based on the specific weaknesses of whatever enemy formation they encountered. Rather than executing the same refined, unchanging doctrine that had served the Imperium reliably for 6,000 years precisely because no opponent had ever forced it to evolve. More critically, Kessler's engineers, working from detailed sensor data gathered during 6 years of limited border skirmishes, had identified a specific and exploitable characteristic of Skarrat capital ship design: an emphasis on massive, centralized shield generators capable of protecting an entire vessel with a single powerful system, rather than the redundant, compartmentalized shielding favored by more defensively cautious species. It was an efficient design, requiring less total power expenditure than distributed alternatives, and it had served the Imperium well against 43 previous opponents who had never possessed the technical sophistication to target it directly. Human weapons, developed specifically over those 6 years to exploit exactly this vulnerability, were designed not for maximum raw destructive power, but for precisely calibrated harmonic strikes capable of overloading a centralized shield generator's core processing array. Given sufficient, simultaneous, coordinated fire, they've built an empire on the assumption that no one will ever be sophisticated enough to hit them where it actually hurts, Kessler told her fleet in the final briefing before departure. For 6,000 years, that assumption has been correct. Today, it stops being correct. The battle, when it finally began at the agreed coordinates near the perimeter colonies, unfolded exactly as Fleet Marshal Killorn had confidently predicted for its opening minutes, and exactly as no Imperial commander in 6,000 years had ever experienced for everything that followed. The Skarrat fleet advanced in the same, disciplined, overwhelming formation that had crushed 43 previous opponents, 160 vessels. Arranged in a classic Imperial dominance pattern, designed to overwhelm an outnumbered enemy through sheer coordinated firepower before any meaningful resistance could organize. Admiral Kessler's 41 vessels did not retreat, did not scatter in panic, and did not attempt the kind of desperate, disorganized resistance Killorn's doctrine was specifically built to crush. Instead, they executed a precise, rehearsed maneuver that Kessler's fleet had drilled more than 200 times in simulation over the preceding 6 months. Concentrating their entire fleet's fire, in perfectly synchronized harmonic bursts, against a single Skarrat capital ship at a time, systematically overloading its centralized shield generator before that vessel's neighbors could adequately reinforce its position. Marshal, the Bashtor's glory, has lost shield integrity, reported Killorn's tactical officer, disbelief evident in her voice within the first 10 minutes of an engagement that should have taken hours to develop any meaningful pattern at all. Weapons fire pattern suggests deliberate, coordinated targeting of our shield generator architecture specifically. This is not a conventional engagement pattern, Marshal. Reinforce the central formation. K'Lorn ordered, still confident this represented nothing more than a fortunate early strike rather than a systemic vulnerability in Imperial ship design itself. Redistribute defensive coverage. But redistribution, K'Lorn's own doctrine, had never anticipated needing, and the fleet's rigid, centuries-old command structure proved poorly suited to adapting its formation in real time against an enemy whose entire fleet was doing exactly that, continuously, ship by ship, exploiting the same specific vulnerability with ruthless, escalating efficiency. By the second hour of the battle, 17 Skarrat capital ships had lost shield integrity and been forced to withdraw or had sustained catastrophic damage to their exposed hulls. By the fourth hour, that number had climbed past 40, and K'Lorn found himself presiding over a battle that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the swift, decisive conquest 6,000 years of Imperial history had led him to expect. "This is not possible," K'Lorn said, more to himself than to his stunned staff, as he watched his fleet's tactical display fill with an alarming density of red damage indicators. "They are a young species. 6 years removed from first contact. This level of coordinated tactical sophistication should not exist." "Marshal," Thrain said, her voice carrying a note of genuine alarm now, "our own analysis suggests the Terrans have spent every year, since first contact specifically preparing for this engagement. Their weapons calibration, their formation discipline, their entire tactical doctrine. It appears to have been built, from the ground up, around exploiting precisely the vulnerabilities in Imperial ship design that our own 6,000 years of unbroken success never forced us to address." K'Lorn absorbed this with the particular horror of a commander realizing, in real time, that an assumption he had never once thought to question had just cost him nearly a third of his deployed fleet. "Signal full withdrawal," he finally ordered, the words carrying a weight no Skarrat fleet marshal had needed to speak aloud in 6,000 years of Imperial military history. "We concede the formal combat trial." It was, by the ancient and rigid terms of Skarrat ritual combat law, an irreversible concession. One that stripped the Imperium not merely of its claim to the contested perimeter colonies, but of the formal right to challenge Terran sovereignty over any disputed territory for a period of 1,000 years, a provision written into Imperial law, millennia, earlier specifically to prevent endless, destabilizing challenges between the Imperium and species it had already formally, if reluctantly, defeated it. Emperor Vashtor Kell received Fleet Marshal K'Lorn's final report, 3 weeks after the battle's conclusion, delivered in person, in the Emperor's private audience chamber with a formality that did little to soften the magnitude of what had occurred. "We assumed their youth meant their inexperience," K'Lorn told the assembled Imperial court, delivering an accounting he knew would define the remainder of his career. Whatever remained of it. "We failed to account for the possibility that a young species, given sufficient warning and sufficient motivation, might spend every available year of that warning doing something no species we had ever challenged before had thought to do. Studying us, specifically, and preparing specifically to defeat the exact doctrine that had made us successful against everyone else." Emperor Kell was silent, for a long moment, studying the tactical recordings of a battle that had cost the Imperium more ships in a single engagement than any conflict in the preceding 2,000 years of its history. "They laughed at our challenge," Kell finally said, reviewing the intercepted human communications his own intelligence services had gathered in the battle's aftermath. Transmissions showing Terran officers reacting to the Imperium's formal challenge, with what Imperial translation software had characterized, with evident confusion, as amusement rather than fear. "Explain this to me, Marshal. Explain why a species facing annihilation would find our challenge humorous rather than terrifying." K'Lorn considered the question carefully before answering, having spent the 3 weeks since the battle's end turning it over in his own mind as well. "I believe, Your Majesty," he said slowly, "that they were not laughing at the challenge itself. I believe they were laughing because, after 6 years of quiet, focused preparation for exactly this moment, they already knew something we did not, that we had just handed them precisely the fight they had spent every year since first contact, hoping we would eventually be arrogant enough to offer them. On Earth, in the aftermath of a victory that had reshaped humanity's standing among the stars overnight, Admiral Diane Kessler, addressed the crews of her combined fleet aboard the flagship that had led the engagement, the weight of 6 years of quiet, relentless preparation finally fully realized. They spent 6,000 years being right. She told her assembled officers, 6,000 years of nobody ever forcing them to ask whether their methods could be beaten, because nobody had ever been given enough time, or enough reason, to actually try. We were given both, and I hope every species watching what happened here today understands exactly what that means going forward. Not that humanity is unbeatable, because no one ever truly is. But that we are a species that takes every single warning seriously, prepares for every fight we're given time to prepare for, and never, ever assumes that because someone has always won before, they'll keep winning against an opponent who actually studied how they do it. The Skarrat Imperium's formal concession, and the 1,000-year prohibition on further challenge that came with it, would stand for generations, as the opening chapter of humanity's rise among the galaxy's older, more established powers, a rise that began not with superior technology, nor overwhelming force, but with 6 quiet years of preparation, and the simple, decisive advantage of an empire that had never once needed to imagine what defeat might actually look like, until the day humanity showed them.